right, young friends, welcome to Ecology Podcast 7. In this part, we're going to be focusing on the question of how do we get an ecosystem in the first place? How did we end up with this temperate deciduous forest ecosystem that we live in here in Central Virginia, for example? Okay, the process in which we would get such an ecosystem is called ecological succession. And it is a stepwise process that would take many, many years to complete itself. It is a series of changes, predictable changes given a climate that you might have that occur in a community of living things over time. So a series of predictable changes that occur in a community over a period of time. Okay? Essentially what happens is you will get an initial community of organisms of some sort that starts to thrive in an area, but over time, because, well, we'll talk about the because in a minute, that community is replaced by other organisms, and so your community begins to change over time. Okay? Essentially, what you need to remember is that it's a simple to complex. We start out with just a few organisms in an area, and then gradually the community gets increasingly complex over many, many years. Okay? There are two major types of successional change in ecosystems. There is primary succession or secondary succession. We will first talk about primary. All right? Primary succession. I want you to imagine yourself. We are in our little kayaks. We're in our little boats out. But how we got in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I have no idea. But here we are in our little boats, in our canoes, whatever, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And then suddenly, in front of us, we begin to see the ocean waters froth and boil and like that, okay? And what is happening is a volcanic island is emerging from the middle of the Pacific Ocean right before our eyes, okay? There is no life on this piece of molten rock, lava rock. It is hot, it is steaming, but over time, this completely barren, inhospitable rock will cool. And lo and behold, eventually, somehow, living things will begin to thrive on the rock. That movement from completely barren, inhospitable rock to something that actually bears life is primary succession. It is succession that occurs in an area that has never had life on it before. Okay, so we are going from barren new rock to life, okay, on this barren rock. So there's our lava rock that emerged out of the Pacific Ocean in front of us. By the way, that does happen. They've observed this happen, I believe, somewhere around Iceland, not too terribly long ago. They were able to observe this very thing happening. Now, in order for life to take hold on that barren rock, there has to be some kind of living thing that can take root there that really does not need a whole lot of anything in order to survive, other than a piece of rock to survive on. These organisms would have to be really hardy, and pioneer species, or are organisms, a term for organisms that are the very first organisms to colonize this barren rock. They are pioneers. Nothing else is there. They're the first. An example would be things like lichens. I bet if you went out in your yard and looked on the side of a tree, or if you have some brick near your house or on your house, you might find some lichen growing, I'm boring myself, okay? I'm yawning. Anyway, so the lichen is an organism. Actually, it's two organisms, and we'll talk about that in a sec, that can survive on nothing more than a barren rock surface. Now, what lichen is really, it is a symbiotic relationship, a mutualistic, so this is another one you can add to your list of mutualistic partners, between a fungus and an algae. Now, what does the algae bring to the table? Well, if you'll recall from our working class, algae is photosynthetic. Algae is photosynthetic, so it is making sugar. It provides food. Fungus is a heterotroph, actually, and so it takes in the sugar that the algae makes, but the fungus is what provides the algae a nice moist environment in which to live. So the fungus is giving the algae a place to live. The algae in turn is providing the fungus with food. Together they are extremely hardy. They don't need a whole lot of support, and they can survive on that barren rock surface. Okay? Now, what the lichen will do, given enough time, is they will begin to break that rock down so that we can actually begin to get the beginnings of soil. And once we get soil, then we can start to get other organisms in there. So these pioneer species are actually there to prepare that environment for other living things that are going to come after them. Okay? Or I don't know that that's what they're there for, but that is what they do. So, primary succession, we are going to start with barren rock. We will get organisms like lichen, which begin to break down the barren rock and thus create soil. The creation of soil is really important. And so once we get soil, we can begin to get other small little plant organisms that can survive in the area. Now, you might ask, how do these little plants get there? Well, perhaps their seeds or spores are blown from one place to another. Perhaps birds carry seeds and drop them or poop them out, or whatever. But the other organisms will eventually get there. And if the environment exists, the beginnings of soil exist where they could survive, then they will. You might say, how did the lichen get there? Again, wind-blown spores, things like that. Okay, so that might be what a place would look like if it were undergoing primary succession. Now, this picture, I want you to understand that these blocks of land represent the same block over time. So we start out with this barren rock. Then this barren rock gets covered with lichen. Then, because soil is created, small plants can come in. Now, what happens when the small plants come in is perhaps they begin to take over and they begin to block out the sunlight that the lichen were thriving on. So the lichen may actually begin to die, but the small plants can take over and thrive. As small plants come in and begin to break down the rock and create even more soil over time, larger plants can come in with their bigger root systems. But again, keep in mind that as larger plants come in, they in turn may change the conditions such that these small plants can no longer survive. So succession is kind of a violent process in that these organisms that thrive here right now may actually be creating the conditions to allow other things to come in that eventually are going to kill them. But the new organisms will survive until ultimately you get organisms like trees growing in this area, and even different kinds of trees that are even taller, blocking out the sunlight and outcompeting the shorter trees and so on. So that eventually, over many, 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 many years, you go from this barren rock to an area that looks like that, okay? Okay. All right, so primary succession then, get in your head. We start with barren rock. We go to where there is lichen on the rock or some other type of pioneer species, but this is the type of pioneer species you'll most often talk about. We get the creation of soil that then would allow small plants to come in. Now, these small plants might make it now inhospitable for the lichen to survive, but they might make it hospitable for small animals to come in and survive. Then as we get increasing amounts of soil, larger plants come in, larger animals come in, and the next thing you know, we have an entirely different looking type of environment than what we started with. Okay? Now, I'm very sorry, my daughter is making it difficult. You're bothering me. Go away.
Yo, yo, yo!
Mm-hmm. All right, secondary succession then. Secondary succession is succession that occurs in an area that has not been completely barren. In fact, life has been in the area before, but perhaps was removed largely for some reason, like perhaps it was clear-cut to make a field, a plowed field. Life had been there, but it was cut down for farming purposes, or perhaps a forest fire or something like that. Now, secondary succession usually happens much quicker than primary succession. Why? Well, because you're not starting from nothing. You're starting from where life had been. There's already soil there, and there's seeds and things present in that soil. So not only we don't have to create soil from scratch, and we don't have to bring seeds in gradually over many, many years as they get blown by the wind or whatever. They're already there in the soil. Okay? Roots and stumps that may be left in the soil can sometimes regenerate themselves. You probably have seen that. Sometimes a tree is cut down, yet little sprigs of life come out from that tree. Stump. The soil also is usually pretty fertile because of the other things that once lived there. So secondary succession happens much more quickly. And we've had tons of it right around us. Anywhere you look, in Chesterfield, just about as a result of secondary succession, where perhaps there was a farm field or whatever, and then that field was plowed down. The forest had been plowed down for the farm field, but then it had been allowed to return again to woodland, to deciduous forest. Okay? Now, a couple of more terms we need before we can stop. Climax community. It is the most stable environment that a given ecosystem that a given environment or climate can support. Okay, I mistyped that in there. So, in our area, the climax community that we are going to get here, because of the kind of climate we have, is going to be a temperate deciduous forest. We would never get, I don't care how long we sat here and waited for it, a tropical rainforest to spring up here in Richmond, Virginia, because our climate cannot support it. What our climate can support, the most complex, the most stable ecosystem that we can support here due to the limitations of our climate, is this temperate deciduous forest that we are familiar with. Okay? So a climax community is the end result of succession. It is that final stable state that succession might result in. So some environments can support incredible amounts of life because of the large amounts of rain and sunlight they get. Others are more limited. Like ours is pretty good, but imagine tundra, where there's not much light, there's not a whole lot of moisture, and so you're very limited into the amount of life that you can get in that area. Okay? So in our area, the climax community is indeed a temperate deciduous forest. Okay? So here's some different climax communities that exist. We also can think of them as biomes, generally speaking. We've got this one, which is, of course, ours. This is a temperate deciduous forest. Here we have this one, a tundra, which you should be familiar with after doing your ANWR research. This, I think, is called a chaparral, which we won't talk too much about that, but it's pretty. And there's a marine environment, a marine biome right there, which we will talk about because Coleman really digs those. So, now, some revisions to this idea of succession. Okay? Ecosystems will very often recover from a natural disturbance, a fire that is started by a lightning strike or whatever. The ecosystem will often recover and look exactly as it did, or within all practical purposes, exactly as it did like before. However, the kinds of disturbances that humans can cause, where the disturbance is sustained over years and years and years and years, long-term human-caused disturbances, may eventually simply be too much for an ecosystem to recover from. And it can. You won't necessarily ever get the same ecosystem in a place that you once had, or else it may take an extremely long time, almost as though you were doing primary succession over again. So, understand that given certain kinds of disturbances, certain kinds of really severe, usually human-caused long-term disturbances, it is not necessarily guaranteed that a disturbed ecosystem will recover to the same type of climax community that it originally had. Okay? All right, and that brings us to a discussion of biomes, and that will be the topic for our next unit of studies. So thank you for watching, and I will catch you at the next podcast.